I was 4 years old when Mother sold me to Master Grimshaw for 3 shillings and a loaf of bread. I remember the morning with a clarity that has never faded, though many years have passed since then. The fog hung thick over our street in Whitechapel, and Mother's hands trembled as she buttoned my shirt for the last time. She did not cry. Women like her had no tears left to shed. Master Grimshaw was a tall man with a face like weathered leather and hands stained permanently black. He looked me up and down as though I were a horse at market, then grunted his approval. "Small enough," he said. "He'll do for the narrow flues." I did not understand what was happening until we had walked for nearly an hour through the winding streets of London. Master Grimshaw pulled me along by the wrist, his grip firm but not cruel. We passed grand houses with polished brass knockers and scrubbed steps, shops with windows full of things I had never seen, and eventually came to a narrow alley where a wagon waited. 3 other boys sat huddled in the back, their faces already grey with soot. "Up you go," Master Grimshaw said, lifting me by the armpits and depositing me among them. The oldest boy, who might have been 7 or 8, looked at me with eyes that seemed ancient. "First time?" he asked. I nodded. He said nothing more, but his expression told me everything I needed to know about what lay ahead. We lived in a cellar beneath a chandler's shop on Drury Lane. The room was perhaps 12 feet square, with stone walls that wept moisture and a floor of packed earth. There were no beds, only piles of sacking where we slept in a heap, like puppies seeking warmth. Master Grimshaw did not sleep there with us. He had rooms above a tavern somewhere, though we never knew exactly where. Each morning before dawn, his heavy boots on the stairs would wake us, and we would scramble to our feet, knowing that slowness invited his cane across our backs. The other boys taught me the trade with a mixture of pity and impatience. There was Tom, the oldest, who had been climbing for 4 years, and could navigate the most treacherous chimneys with the sure-footedness of a cat. There was Harry, who wheezed when he breathed, and whose knees were covered in scabs that never properly healed. There was little George, barely older than myself, who cried at night when he thought we were asleep. And there was me, the newest acquisition, the one who had yet to prove his worth. My first chimney was in a great house on Russell Square. Master Grimshaw rapped on the servants' entrance with his stick, and a housekeeper with a pinched face let us in through the scullery. The kitchen was warm and smelled of baking bread, and I remember thinking how wonderful it would be to live in such a place. The housekeeper led us to the drawing-room, where a cold hearth gaped like a mouth waiting to swallow me whole. "This one's straightforward," Master Grimshaw told Tom. "Good for teaching." He turned to me. "You'll go up behind Tom. Watch what he does. Keep your elbows in tight. Press with your knees and feet. Move steady, not fast. You fall, you'll break your neck, and I'll be out 3 shillings. Tom stripped down to his shirt and breeches. I did the same, my fingers fumbling with the buttons. Master Grimshaw handed Tom his scraping tool and a small brush, then pushed us both toward the fireplace. The opening seemed impossibly small as I approached it, a black square that led nowhere but up into darkness. Tom went first, disappearing into the chimney with practiced ease. I heard his knees and elbows scraping against brick as he climbed. Then Master Grimshaw's hand was on my shoulder, propelling me forward. "Go on, boy, I ain't got all day." I crouched and entered the flue. Immediately, the world contracted to a space barely wider than my shoulders. Above me, I could hear Tom moving, dislodging small cascades of soot that rained down onto my face. The darkness was absolute. I could see nothing, not even my hands pressed against the sooty walls on either side of me. "Climb." Master Grimshaw's voice echoed up from below. "Use your knees and back." I pressed my knees against one wall and my back against the other, then pushed upward. My body wedged in the narrow space, and for a terrible moment I thought I was stuck, that I would die there in the darkness, suffocated by brick and soot. Then something gave, and I moved upward an inch, then another. The technique was brutally simple. Press out with your limbs, shift your weight, push upward, repeat. Every inch was earned through effort and pain. The soot was everywhere. It filled my nose and mouth, coated my throat, burned my eyes. I coughed, and the sound was muffled by the close walls. Above me, Tom called down encouragement. "That's it, keep coming." Not much farther to the first bend. The bend, I had not considered that chimneys were not straight vertical shafts. When I reached it, I found the flue turned at a sharp angle, creating a narrow diagonal passage. Tom was already through it, his voice now coming from somewhere above and to the left. I twisted my body, trying to force myself around the corner. My shoulder jammed against brick. I could not move forward or backward. Panic seized me. I tried to cry out, but my voice emerged as a strangled gasp, immediately muffled by the soot that filled my mouth. I thrashed, scraping my knees raw, and somehow the movement freed me. I slithered around the bend and found myself in another vertical section, this one even narrower than the first. "Good lad," Tom called down. Almost to the top now. My arms trembled with exhaustion. My lungs burned. Every breath brought more soot, more choking blackness. But I continued climbing, inch by terrible inch, until suddenly Tom's hand reached down and grabbed my wrist. He pulled, and I emerged into blinding daylight at the chimney top, gasping and retching. We were on the roof of the house, 3 stories above Russell Square. The wind was cold and clean, and I sucked in great lungfuls of it, coughing out the soot that had accumulated in my throat. Tom patted my back with something approaching gentleness. "You did well for your first time," he said. "Some boys can't make it up at all. Master has to haul them out by their ankles." We descended back through the chimney, scraping and brushing as we went. This was the true work, dislodging years of creosote build-up from the walls of the flue, sending it cascading down to where Master Grimshaw waited with his collecting sack. The scraping tool was a piece of metal with a sharp edge, and Tom showed me how to work it back and forth against the brick, loosening the black tarry substance that clung there. Going down was in some ways worse than going up. The soot we had dislodged fell directly onto our heads and shoulders, a continuous black rain that got into our ears and noses and the corners of our eyes. By the time we emerged back into the drawing room, we were completely black, unrecognizable as human children. Only our eyes showed any color, and even those were red and streaming. The housekeeper gave us each a crust of bread and a cup of water, served in the yard where we could not dirty her clean floors. We ate, standing up, too tired to speak. Master Grimshaw collected his payment from the housekeeper, shilling for the job band. Then we moved on to the next house, and the next. That first day, we climbed 7 chimneys. By the time we returned to our cellar, I could barely stand. My knees were bleeding through my breeches. My elbows were rubbed raw. My throat was so sore from the soot that I could not swallow the thin gruel Master Grimshaw had left for our supper. I collapsed onto the sacking, and knew nothing more until his boots on the stairs woke me the next morning. The days that followed blurred into a monotonous pattern. We rose before dawn and worked until after dark, climbing 4 or 5, or sometimes 8 chimneys each day. Master Grimshaw took us to all corners of London. The grand houses of Mayfair, the comfortable homes of merchants in the city, the hotels and clubs of St. James's, even occasionally, to the poorer neighborhoods where the chimneys were no less in need of sweeping, but the payment was considerably less. I learned to read the chimneys like Tom did, to know from the smell and feel whether they were old or new, whether they had been regularly maintained or left to accumulate dangerous levels of creosote. I learned which houses had the narrowest flues, which had dangerous bends, which had crumbling mortars that might give way beneath your weight. I learned to climb in total darkness, navigating by touch alone, my body memorizing the movements required to ascend and descend. But most of all, I learned pain. The pain of scraped knees and elbows that never healed, always reopening with each new climb. The pain of breathing air so thick with soot that it felt like drowning. The pain of hunger, for Master Grimshaw fed us barely enough to keep us alive. The pain of cold in winter, when the cellar froze and we had only our thin clothing and each other as body heat for warmth. And the pain of loneliness, for though we lived together, we were too exhausted and too hopeless to form true friendships. George was the first to die. It happened on a January morning, bitterly cold, with frost coating the streets. We had been sent to a house in Bloomsbury, a doctor's residence with a particularly tall chimney that rose for stories. George had gone up first, being the smallest, to navigate a narrow section near the top. We heard him climbing, heard the scrape of his knees against brick, heard his labored breathing echoing down. Then we heard him cough, a deep rattling sound that went on and on. Tom called up, "You all right?" The coughing continued, then stopped abruptly. We waited, but there was no sound of movement, no response to Tom's increasingly urgent calls. Master Grimshaw swore and sent Tom up after him. I waited in the drawing room, my heart hammering, while the doctor's wife watched with her hand pressed to her mouth. Tom descended alone. "He's stuck," he said quietly. "About 20 feet up. Not moving." Master Grimshaw had to pay a bricklayer to break through the chimney from the outside. They pulled George out in pieces. That is not quite accurate, but it is how I remember it. He had become wedged in a narrow section, unable to move up or down, and had suffocated there in the darkness. His face, when they brought him out, was peaceful. He looked like he was sleeping. Master Grimshaw was angry about the cost of the bricklayer. He did not purchase a proper burial for George. Instead, the body was taken to a pauper's field and dumped in an unmarked grave. That night in the cellar, Tom and Harry and I did not speak. What was there to say? We had all known this could happen. We had all come close ourselves, stuck in chimneys, choking on soot, our bodies wedged so tight we could not draw breath. George had simply run out of luck. Master Grimshaw replaced him within a week with another boy named Bill, purchased from a workhouse in Suffolk. Bill was thin, even by our standards, with arms like sticks and a persistent cough. He lasted 3 months before the cough got so bad he could not climb. Master Grimshaw sold him to a rag-and-bone man for 6pence. I was 6 years old by then, a veteran of the trade. I could climb any chimney, no matter how narrow or treacherous. I had learned to ignore the pain, to push my body beyond what seemed possible. I had also learned to hate. I hated Master Grimshaw with a pure, cold fury that kept me warm on freezing mornings. I hated the fine ladies and gentlemen in their grand houses who looked through us as though we were not human children but merely tools, as inanimate as the brushes and scrapers we carried. I hated London itself, this vast, indifferent city that consumed children like me and never noticed. But hatred was a luxury I could rarely indulge. Survival required all my energy and attention. Each chimney was a fresh challenge, a new opportunity to die. There were the straightforward ones, to be sure, simple vertical shafts that could be climbed with relative ease. But there were also the nightmares, chimneys with multiple bends, chimneys that narrowed unexpectedly halfway up, chimneys with loose bricks that could trap your hand or foot, chimneys still hot from recent fires that burned your skin as you climbed. One house in particular has stayed in my memory. It belonged to a banker in Kensington, a man who prided himself on his modern establishment. His chimneys were built in the new style, with multiple flues converging into a single main shaft. Master Grimshaw sent me up the kitchen flue, which was supposed to connect to the main shaft about 15 feet up. I climbed the kitchen flue easily enough, then found the junction where it met the main shaft. But as I tried to move into the main shaft, I discovered that the opening was much smaller than expected, perhaps 8 inches square. I was already small for my age, stunted by malnutrition, but 8 inches was barely enough space to fit my head and one shoulder through. "Can't fit," I called down to Master Grimshaw. "Try harder," came the reply. I pressed against the opening, forcing my head and right shoulder through. My left shoulder jammed against the edge. I twisted, trying to work my way through, and succeeded in getting both shoulders into the opening. Now I was stuck, half in the kitchen flue and half in the main shaft, unable to move forward or back. Panic, which I had learned to control, seized me. I thrashed, scraping skin from my shoulders and back. The more I struggled, the more firmly wedged I became. My chest was compressed. I could not draw a full breath. Black spots danced before my eyes. "Help!" I tried to call, but it came out as barely a whisper. I do not know how long I was stuck there. It might have been minutes or hours. Time lost all meaning in the darkness. I felt my consciousness beginning to slip away, felt myself drifting toward the same peaceful sleep that had claimed George. Then, from some deep reserve I did not know I possessed, I found a last burst of strength. I twisted violently, felt something tear my shirt, or perhaps my skin, and suddenly I was through, tumbling into the main shaft, free. I clung to the walls of the shaft, gasping, my heart racing. Above me, I could see a square of grey light, the top of the chimney. Below, I could hear Master Grimshaw calling, his voice tinged with concern, not for me, but for his lost investment. Slowly, painfully, I climbed down. When I emerged into the kitchen, covered in blood and soot, the cook screamed. Master Grimshaw examined me with professional detachment. "Can you work?" My entire back was raw. My shoulders were bleeding, but I nodded. We had 3 more chimneys to climb that day. Tom taught me a song that the sweeps sang, a grim little ditty that went, "Up through the dark and the smoke I go, black as the coal and white as the snow. When I am stuck and cannot fall, nobody hears me when I call." We never sang it where Master Grimshaw could hear. It was our song, belonging to us children of the smoke. a small rebellion against the world that used us so carelessly. Winter was the worst season. The demand for chimney sweeping was highest, as everyone wanted their chimneys clean and safe before winter fires were lit regularly. We worked longer hours, climbed more chimneys, came back to our cellar so exhausted we could barely drag ourselves to our sleeping sacks. The cold was a constant companion, seeping through our thin clothes, numbing our fingers and toes. Many mornings, we had to break ice in our water bucket to drink. But winter also brought one small mercy: hot chimneys. When we were sent to clean a chimney where a fire had been lit recently, the residual warmth was almost pleasant. We had to be careful, of course, not to climb too soon after the fire had been extinguished, lest we burn ourselves. But a chimney that retained gentle warmth was a luxury compared to the frigid ones we climbed most often. Harry died in my second winter. He had always been the weakest of us. His breathing labored, his cough persistent. One morning he simply could not get up. He lay on his pile of sacking wheezing, his lips tinged blue. Master Grimshaw looked at him with disgust. "Lazy sod," he said, and aimed a kick at Harry's ribs. Harry did not react. His eyes were open but unfocused. Tom, who was braver than I, stepped between Master Grimshaw and Harry. "He's sick," Tom said. "Real sick. Needs a doctor." Master Grimshaw snorted. "Doctor costs money. He'll get better or he won't." He turned to me. "You're climbing his share today." We left Harry in the cellar and went out to work. When we returned that evening, Harry was dead. His body had already begun to stiffen. Master Grimshaw arranged for its disposal the same way he had George's, the pauper's field. No marker, no ceremony. That night, Tom and I dug through our few possessions and found a bent nail Harry had kept, polished smooth by constant handling. We kept it, passing it back and forth between us, a small memorial to our lost companion. Master Grimshaw bought a new boy named Jack to replace Harry. Jack was different from the rest of us. He had come from a family that had fallen on hard times rather than being born into poverty, and he remembered what it was like to have enough to eat, to sleep in a real bed, to be treated with kindness. This made him both proud and vulnerable. He worked hard, climbed well, but he could not accept his circumstances the way Tom and I had learned to do. "We should run away," Jack said one night, as we lay in the cellar. "Just go, find new lives."
Tom shook his head. "Where would we go? Look at us. We're covered in soot, wearing rags. The constables would catch us and bring us back, and then Master would beat us half to death." "But there must be something better than this," Jack insisted. "There must be." I wanted to believe him, but I had been climbing for 2 years by then. I knew there was nothing better for boys like us. We were caught, trapped as surely as if we were wedged in a chimney, with no way up and no way down. Spring brought its own challenges. The demand for sweeping declined as people used their fireplaces less frequently. Master Grimshaw had to compete more aggressively for jobs, which meant he took on the most difficult and dangerous work that other sweeps avoided. We found ourselves climbing chimneys that had not been cleaned in years, where the creosote buildup was so thick it had become flammable. We climbed chimneys in buildings scheduled for demolition, where the masonry was crumbling and could give way at any moment. We climbed chimneys in factories, where the heat and fumes were overwhelming. It was in a factory chimney that Jack died. The factory produced dyes, and its chimney was coated not just with soot, but with chemical residues that burned the skin on contact. Master Grimshaw had been paid extra to clean it, as it was considered particularly unpleasant work. He sent Jack up first, with me to follow. Jack had climbed perhaps 20 feet when he started to scream. Not the grunt of pain we were all familiar with, but genuine screams of agony. I looked up and saw in the dim light filtering down from above that his hands were smoking where they touched the chimney walls. The chemical residues were burning him. "Come down!" I shouted up to him, but Jack was panicking. Instead of descending carefully, he tried to rush, and in his haste he slipped. I pressed myself against the wall as he fell past me, his screams echoing in the narrow shaft. He hit the bottom with a sound I will never forget. When I climbed down, I found Master Grimshaw standing over Jack's body. One of the boy's legs was bent at an impossible angle, and blood pooled beneath his head. But he was still alive, moaning softly. "Please," Jack whispered. "Help me." Master Grimshaw looked at him for a long moment, then shook his head. "Can't work with a broken leg," he said, as if that were the relevant consideration. He turned to the factory foreman. "I'll need another boy to finish the job. This one's no good. They left Jack lying there while I climbed the chimney alone, my hands burning from the same chemicals that had caused his fall. When I came down, Jack was dead. Master Grimshaw had the body removed and went to collect his payment. That night, Tom and I sat in silence in the cellar. We were alone now, the only two left of the original group I had joined. All the others were dead, George, Harry, Jack and Bill before them. Tom was 9 years old. I was 7. We were ancient. How much longer? I asked Tom. It was the first time I had voiced the question. Tom understood what I meant. Until we're too big to fit in the chimneys, he said. Or until we die. Whichever comes first. And then what? He shrugged. I don't know. Master will sell us on, I suppose, to a factory or a workhouse, or we'll just be turned out on the street. Neither option seemed preferable to what we had now, which was itself unbearable. We were caught in a trap with no escape. Summer arrived, bringing heat that made the city smell even worse than usual. The Thames stank, the street stank, the cellar stank. We climbed fewer chimneys, but still climbed enough to keep us exhausted. Master Grimshaw began to drink more heavily, which made him unpredictable. Sometimes he forgot to bring us food. Other times he would fly into rages over minor infractions, beating us with his cane until we could barely move. Tom began to change. He had always been the steady one, the one who kept going no matter what. But something broke in him after Jack's death. He became reckless, taking chances in the chimneys that made my heart stop. He would climb too fast, trust crumbling bricks, navigate dangerous bends without proper care. It was as if he no longer cared whether he lived or died. You're going to fall, I told him one day after he had taken a particularly dangerous shortcut through a chimney. Good, he said simply. I did not know how to respond to that. I was only 7 years old, but I understood. The will to live was something we all had to fight for every day, and Tom was losing that fight. One August morning we were sent to a house in Belgravia. It was one of the grandest houses we had ever worked in, with marble floors and gilt mirrors and chandeliers that sparkled like captured stars. The chimney was tall and narrow, rising through 4 floors. Master Grimshaw sent Tom up first, then me. I was halfway up, navigating a tricky bend, when I heard Tom call down from above. Look after yourself, he said. Before I could ask what he meant, I heard scrabbling sounds, then silence. I waited, but Tom did not move. I called up to him, but there was no response. With growing dread, I climbed toward where I had last heard his voice. I found him wedged in a narrow section about 10 feet above me. His eyes were open, but he was not breathing. At first I thought he had gotten stuck, like George. But as I drew closer, I realized the truth. The section where he had stopped was not that narrow. He could have pushed through. Instead, he had simply stopped climbing and stayed there until his breath ran out. He had chosen this. I climbed down and told Master Grimshaw that Tom was stuck. The usual procedure followed. A bricklayer was called, the wall was broken through, Tom's body was removed. Master Grimshaw paid for the repair to the chimney and cursed the loss of a good climber. Tom was taken to the pauper's field. I was alone now. Master Grimshaw bought 2 new boys to replace Tom and Jack, young children of 5 and 6 named Sam and Ned. I was the veteran now, the one who taught the new boys how to climb, how to breathe shallowly to avoid inhaling too much soot, how to find handholds in the darkness. I heard myself saying the same things Tom had said to me. Not much farther. You're doing well. Keep climbing. But I did not feel like Tom. I felt hollow, empty of everything except the will to survive one more day. I climbed chimneys mechanically, without thought or feeling. I ate when food was provided, slept when I could, worked when ordered. I was 8 years old and felt 100. The years that followed are difficult to separate in my memory. They blur together into an endless procession of chimneys and cellars, of pain and exhaustion, of new boys who arrived and died or were sold away. Sam lasted 6 months before he was sold to a factory. Ned died in a chimney collapse. There were others after them, Peter and Michael and William and Charles and boys, whose names I never learned before they were gone. Master Grimshaw grew older and meaner. His drinking worsened, and on several occasions he was too drunk to work. On those days I took charge, leading the younger boys to the jobs we had been contracted for, collecting the payment, bringing it back to Master. He never thanked me, but he beat me less often than he did the others. I learned to read after a fashion. A kindly housekeeper in Hampstead noticed me looking at a newspaper that had been left in the scullery. She spent a few minutes teaching me letters, showing me how they formed words. After that, I read whenever I had the chance. Scraps of newspaper used for wrapping, signs in shop windows, broadsheets pasted to walls. The words opened a window into a world beyond chimneys and soot, a world I could visit only in my imagination. I learned about reform movements, about people who wanted to ban the use of children as chimney sweeps. I read speeches by lords and ladies who declared the practice barbaric. I read newspaper accounts of climbing boys who had died, their deaths described in heartbreaking detail. But nothing changed. The reform movements proposed legislation, but it never passed. The lords and ladies gave speeches, but they still hired Master Grimshaw to clean their chimneys. And boys like me kept climbing, kept dying, kept being replaced. When I was 10 years old, I began to grow too large for the narrowest chimneys. This should have been a relief, a sign that my time climbing was coming to an end. Instead, it filled me with dread. What would Master Grimshaw do with me when I could no longer climb? Would he sell me to a factory, where I would work 16 hours a day at some dangerous machine? Would he turn me out onto the street, where I would almost certainly starve? I tried to make myself useful in other ways. I learned to repair the brushes and scrapers, to mix the cleaning solutions we sometimes used, to negotiate with housekeepers and servants. I learned to keep basic accounts, tracking the jobs we completed and the payments we received. Master Grimshaw noticed and began to use me as a kind of assistant, sending me ahead to scout chimneys before he brought the younger boys. But my respite was temporary. By the time I was 11, I simply could not fit in many of the chimneys we were contracted to clean. Master Grimshaw began to look at me with an expression I recognized. I had seen him look at older boys the same way before they disappeared. One February morning, he told me to come with him, leaving the younger boys behind. We walked through the morning fog to a part of London I did not recognize, somewhere near the docks. The smell of the river was strong, mixed with the sense of tar and rope and fish. We stopped at a warehouse, and Master Grimshaw went inside to speak with a man in a counting house. When he emerged, he was counting coins. He jerked his head at me. "You're sold," he said. "You'll be working here now." I stared at him. After 7 years, this was how it ended. No warning, no explanation, just sold like a piece of equipment that had outlived its usefulness. "Can I began. But he was already walking away. "Not my concern anymore," he called back without turning around. The man from the counting house came out and looked me over. He was fat and prosperous looking, with elaborate side whiskers and a gold watch chain. "Can you read, boy?" "Yes, sir." He looked surprised. "Well, that's something. You'll be working in the rope loft. Follow me." The rope loft was at the top of the warehouse, a huge open space where workers sat making and repairing ropes. The work was hard. My hands, already damaged from years of climbing, soon became torn and blistered from handling the rough hemp fibers. But it was clean work, or cleaner than climbing chimneys. I could breathe without choking. I could stand upright. I could see the sky through the high windows. I was given a pallet in a dormitory with other workers, a rough mattress that felt like a cloud after years of sleeping on sacking. I was fed regular meals, thin gruel and bread in the morning, bread and cheese at midday, sometimes stew in the evening. It was not much, but it was more than Master Grimshaw had provided. The other workers were a mixed group, men and women, boys and girls, all doing piecework for the rope manufacturer. They were not friendly exactly, but they were not hostile either. They taught me the tricks of the trade, how to splice and bind, how to test the strength of a rope, how to work quickly without sacrificing quality. At night, lying on my pallet, I thought about the boys still working for Master Grimshaw. I had learned their names and forgotten them, watched them arrive and disappear. How many had there been? 20? 30? More? I did not know. They blurred together in my memory, a procession of small soot-covered ghosts. I thought about Tom especially, about the choice he had made in that chimney in Belgravia. I understood it better now. There was a kind of freedom in deciding when and how to die, in taking control of the one thing that could be controlled. But I also felt angry at him for leaving me, for taking the easy way out while I had to keep going. I worked in the rope loft for 2 years. I grew stronger, taller, healthier. The soot gradually worked its way out of my lungs, though I still coughed sometimes, bringing up black phlegm that reminded me of those years in the chimneys. The scars on my knees and elbows faded but never disappeared. My hands remained twisted and gnarled, permanently shaped by the work I had done as a child. When I was 13, the rope manufacturer went bankrupt. The warehouse closed, and we were all turned out. I found work where I could, hauling coal, sweeping streets, running errands for shop owners. I slept in doorways and under bridges, ate scraps when I could find them, stole when I had to. I was surviving, but only just. One day I saw Master Grimshaw. I was in Covent Garden, hoping to find work at the market, when I spotted him walking through the crowds. He looked older, more bent, his face even more weathered. He was pulling along a small boy by the wrist, just as he had pulled me all those years ago. The boy looked terrified. I followed them, keeping to the shadows. They went to a house in a decent neighborhood, and I watched as Master Grimshaw sent the boy up a chimney. I listened to the small, frightened sounds echoing from the flue, and I felt something break inside me. All the anger I had kept buried for years came flooding back. When Master Grimshaw came out of the house, I was waiting for him in the alley. He did not recognize me at first. I had grown too much, changed too much. "Master Grimshaw," I said, and something in my voice made him look at me more closely. "Do I know you? You bought me when I was 4 years old. I climbed for you for 7 years. Recognition dawned on his face, followed quickly by wariness. "That was business, boy. Nothing personal. George died in a chimney," I said. "Harry died sick in the cellar. Jack fell in a factory chimney. Tom suffocated himself rather than keep climbing. How many others? How many boys did you kill?" He stepped back, his hand moving to the cane he always carried. "I didn't kill nobody. Boys die. That's the way of things. You bought children and sent them to die in the darkness for a few shillings," I said. "That's murder." "Big words from a street rat," he sneered. "What are you going to do about it? Go to the constables? They won't care. Nobody cares about climbing boys." He was right, and we both knew it. I stood there trembling with rage and grief and helplessness, and I could do nothing. He pushed past me and walked away, already calling for the boy to come down from the chimney. I did not follow him. What would be the point? Master Grimshaw was just one man in a system that consumed children by the thousands. Even if I could have stopped him, there would be 10 others to take his place. The problem was not one cruel sweepmaster. It was a society that looked at children like me and saw nothing but tools to be used and discarded. But I could tell my story. That much, at least, I could do. I found work at a printer's shop, apprenticing as a typesetter. It was difficult work. The letters were tiny, and my damaged hands struggled to place them quickly and accurately. But I persisted. I learned the trade, and in my spare time I began to write. I wrote about the cellar where we lived, about the darkness of the chimneys, about the pain and fear and endless exhaustion. I wrote about George and Harry and Jack and Tom. I wrote about Master Grimshaw's casual cruelty, about the fine ladies and gentlemen who employed him, about the system that made it all possible. My first attempts were clumsy. I had learned to read, but writing was different. The words came out stiff and awkward, nothing like the flowing prose I read in newspapers and books. But I kept trying, writing page after page in the evenings after my work at the printers was done. I used scraps of paper that would otherwise have been thrown away, writing in the margins between the lines, wherever there was space. The printer, Mr. Hartley, discovered what I was doing one evening when he came back to the shop for a forgotten ledger. He found me hunched over the compositor's bench, writing by candlelight. "What's this?" he asked, picking up one of my pages. I tried to snatch it back, but he held it away from me and began to read. His expression changed as he worked through my cramped handwriting. When he finished, he looked at me with something I had rarely seen directed at myself: respect. "You were a climbing boy," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, sir." "How old were you when you started?" "4, sir." He was quiet for a long moment. "My own son is 4, he said finally. "I cannot imagine." He trailed off, then seemed to collect himself. "You should finish this. Write the whole story. I'll give you paper and ink. Good paper, mind you, not scraps." "Why?" I asked, suspicious of unexpected kindness. "Because people need to know," he said simply. "They need to know what happens in those chimneys. Most of them have no idea," so I wrote. Every evening after work, sometimes late into the night, I wrote. Mr. Hartley was true to his word, providing me with paper and ink, even giving me a small desk in a corner of the shop where I could work undisturbed. The other workers thought I was strange, wasting my time writing when I could be sleeping or drinking or seeking other amusements. But I did not care what they thought. The story poured out of me weeks and then months of writing. I wrote about my mother's trembling hands as she buttoned my shirt for the last time. I wrote about my first chimney, the terror of that darkness. I wrote about learning to climb, about the pain that became so constant I barely noticed it anymore. I wrote about the deaths one after another, boys used up and discarded like broken tools, but I also wrote about small moments of grace. The housekeeper who taught me letters, the cook who sometimes gave us extra bread, Tom's kindness in teaching me the trade, the bent nail we kept as a memorial to Harry, the song we sang when Master Grimshaw could not hear. These small human moments in the midst of inhumanity, they mattered too. When I finished, I had written nearly 200 pages. Mr. Hartley read through them over the course of a week, and when he was done, he sat me down in his office. "This needs to be published," he said. "Properly published as a book. I have a friend who publishes social reform literature. I think he would be interested." I felt a flutter of hope quickly suppressed. Why would anyone want to read about a climbing boy? "Because you're still alive," Mr. Hartley said. "Most boys who go into that trade don't survive to tell their story. You have, and you've told it well, better than well. You've made those boys live on the page, George and Tom and the others. They're not just names anymore. They're real." The publisher, a stern man named Mr. Blackwood, agreed to take on the manuscript. He edited it heavily, correcting my grammar and spelling, restructuring some passages for better flow. But he kept the heart of it intact. The darkness, the pain, the waste of young lives. The book was published 6 months later, under the title Memoirs of a Climbing Boy. I did not expect much from it. Perhaps a few copies would sell to reform-minded individuals, and that would be the end of it. But something unexpected happened. People read it. They talked about it. Newspapers reviewed it, often quoting long passages. Reform societies used excerpts in their pamphlets. Within a year it had gone through 3 printings. More importantly, it had an effect. The book gave faces and names to the anonymous climbing boys who died in chimneys across London. It made their suffering real in a way that statistics and speeches never could. Parliamentarians quoted from it during debates. Clergymen cited it in sermons. Teachers read passages to their students. A new reform bill was introduced, stronger than previous attempts. It faced fierce opposition from master sweeps and property owners who claimed that mechanical sweeping devices were inferior to climbing boys. But the tide had turned. The horror of what was being done to children could no longer be ignored or dismissed. The bill passed. It was not perfect. Enforcement was weak, and many master sweeps continued to employ young boys in violation of the law. But it was a start. Gradually, over the years that followed, the practice declined. Mechanical sweeping devices improved. Public opinion hardened against those who continued to use children. I was 20 years old when the law passed. I had spent 16 years living with the consequences of my childhood in the chimneys, and I would spend the rest of my life living with them still. The damage to my lungs never fully healed. I coughed every winter, sometimes bringing up blood. My hands never regained their full flexibility. I woke often from nightmares of being trapped in darkness, unable to breathe, wedged so tightly I could not move. But I was alive. I had survived, and I had done something with that survival. I had told the story that needed to be told. Mr. Hartley made me a partner in his printing business. It was an act of extraordinary generosity, taking a former climbing boy and making him an equal. We printed books and newspapers and broadsheets, including many related to social reform. I used my share of the profits to support efforts to help former climbing boys, boys who had aged out of the trade and been cast onto the streets with no skills and no prospects. I never married. How could I? What kind of husband or father would I make? Waking screaming from nightmares, coughing up black phlegm, my body broken before I was 30. But I formed friendships, real ones, with people who valued me for who I was rather than what I could do. Mr. Hartley became something like a father to me. His wife treated me with maternal kindness. Their children, who would never have to climb a chimney or fear being sold, called me uncle. I thought often about Tom's question. How much longer? For him, the answer had been until he could not bear it anymore. For me, the answer seemed to be, as long as I have something to contribute, something to say, some way to make meaning out of what happened to us. Years passed. I watched London change around me. The great houses that I had climbed through as a child were renovated, their chimneys modernized or replaced entirely. New buildings rose with different heating systems, reducing the need for chimney sweeps altogether. The streets I had walked as a climbing boy, hunched and exhausted and covered in soot, became cleaner, brighter, more prosperous. But not everyone shared in this prosperity. Even as the practice of using climbing boys ended, other forms of child labor continued. Children worked in factories, in mines, in workshops. They were maimed by machinery, sickened by toxic fumes, worked until they dropped from exhaustion. The particular horror I had experienced was fading, but the underlying problem remained, a society that valued profit over the welfare of its youngest members. I wrote other books, other pamphlets, always returning to the theme of children and labor. I testified before parliamentary committees. I gave speeches at Reform Society meetings. I was no longer the traumatized boy who had emerged from Master Grimshaw's service. I had become an advocate, a voice for those who had no voice, but I never forgot where I came from. I never let the comfortable life I had built insulate me from the reality of what children were still enduring. Every winter, when the first cold snap came and people began lighting their fires, I thought of the boys who would be climbing through darkness, their bodies wedged in narrow flues, their lungs filling with soot. Even after it became illegal, I knew it was still happening. Laws could be evaded, authorities bribed or simply indifferent. When I was 30 years old, I received a letter. It was written in a childish hand on cheap paper, and it came from a boy named Robert who had read my book. He was 12 years old and had been climbing since he was 5. His master was cruel, he wrote, and he was afraid he would die like the boys in my story. Could I help him? I took the letter to the authorities, but they were unhelpful. Without more specific information about where Robert lived or who his master was, they could do nothing. I tried to trace the letter back to its origin, but the postal mark was smudged and illegible. I never heard from Robert again. I do not know what happened to him. Perhaps he escaped his master. Perhaps he grew too large to climb and was sold on to some other brutal trade. Perhaps he died in a chimney somewhere, another nameless boy whose death went unnoticed except by those who depended on his labor. His letter haunted me. For all that I had accomplished, for all the change the reform movement had achieved, there were still boys like Robert slipping through the cracks. The system was better than it had been, but it was far from perfect. I redoubled my efforts. I worked with charitable organizations to create refuges for former climbing boys, places where they could learn a trade and receive medical care. I lobbied for stronger enforcement of the existing laws and for new legislation to close loopholes. I wrote articles for newspapers, gave more speeches, testified at more hearings. The work was exhausting, but it gave me purpose. Every boy we helped, every master sweep prosecuted, every chimney modernized was a small victory. They did not bring back George or Harry or Jack or Tom. They did not erase the years of suffering. But they meant that fewer boys would have to experience what we had experienced. One autumn afternoon, I was walking through Whitechapel, the neighborhood where I had been born. It had changed little in the decades since I had left. The streets were still narrow and filthy, the buildings still decrepit, the people still desperate. I found the street where my mother had lived, though the specific house was gone, replaced by a slightly less decrepit building. I stood there, trying to remember that morning when she had sold me to Master Grimshaw. I had been angry at her for years, feeling betrayed, but standing there as an adult, seeing the grinding poverty that still defined this neighborhood, I understood. She had not sold me out of cruelty, but out of desperation. 3 shillings and a loaf of bread might have meant the difference between life and death for her and whatever other children she might have had. I wondered if she was still alive, if she ever thought about the small boy she had given away. I wondered if she knew that I had survived, that I had even prospered in a modest way. But I did not try to find her. What would be the point? We were strangers now, connected only by blood and a single terrible decision made long ago. As I turned to leave, I saw a small boy, perhaps 5 years old, walking with his mother. He was thin and poorly dressed, but he was laughing at something, his face bright with innocent joy. His mother held his hand tightly, protectively. I watched them until they disappeared around a corner, and I felt something loosen in my chest. That boy would not be sold to a sweepmaster. The law, imperfect as it was, provided at least that much protection. He might face other hardships, other forms of exploitation, but he would not have to climb through darkness with his lungs full of soot. That was something. It was not enough, but it was something. I was 45 when Mr. Hartley died. He had been ill for some time, his body slowly failing, but his mind remained sharp until the end. I sat with him in his final days, and we talked about the years we had worked together, the books we had printed, the causes we had supported. You know, he said one afternoon, his voice weak, when I first met you I saw a broken boy. Damaged beyond repair, I thought. But I was wrong. You weren't broken. You were bent, twisted by what had been done to you, but not broken. You had a core of steel that nothing could break. I don't feel like steel, I told him. I feel tired, he smiled. We're all tired. That's what happens when you fight against the world. But you've made a difference. Never doubt that. Those boys you wrote about, George and Tom and the others, they didn't die for nothing. Their story changed things. After his death, I continued running the printing business with his son, who had grown into a capable man with his father's principles and kindness. But I was increasingly drawn to direct work with children. I volunteered at schools in poor neighborhoods, teaching reading and writing to boys who would otherwise never learn. I visited hospitals where children injured in industrial accidents were treated. I served on committees evaluating applications to charitable funds. This work brought me into contact with hundreds of children over the years. Most of them had hard lives, harder than any child should have to endure. But they were not climbing boys. That particular horror had largely been eliminated, driven out by a combination of law, technology, and public disgust. Sometimes, though, I would meet a child whose eyes reminded me of my own at that age. Eyes that had seen too much, that held knowledge no child should possess. When I saw those eyes, I knew I was looking at a survivor of something terrible. I would do what I could for such children, though I knew from my own experience that some wounds never fully heal. I was 50 years old when I climbed my last chimney. It was not for work, of course. Those days were long behind me. Instead, it was for a demonstration. A group of reformers wanted to show members of Parliament what climbing boys had actually experienced. They constructed a model chimney, full scale, with bends and narrow sections, just like real chimneys. They asked me to climb it as I had done as a child. I hesitated. I had not been in a chimney for nearly 40 years. The thought of entering that darkness again, of feeling those walls close around me, filled me with dread. But I agreed because I understood the importance of what they were trying to achieve. The demonstration was held in a public square. A crowd gathered to watch, including several members of Parliament. The model chimney looked innocuous from the outside, just a brick structure perhaps 20 feet tall. But I knew what it would be like inside. I stripped to my shirt and breeches as I had done as a child. My body was heavier now, my movements stiffer. I approached the opening, which seemed even smaller than I remembered. For a moment, I thought I would not be able to do it, that I would freeze at the entrance and humiliate myself in front of the crowd. Then I remembered Tom and George and Harry and Jack. I remembered all the boys who had climbed and died so that rich people could have clean chimneys. I remembered why I was doing this. I crouched and entered the flue. The darkness enveloped me instantly. The walls pressed in on all sides. I could feel my heart racing, my breath coming faster. I forced myself to calm down, to remember the techniques I had learned as a child. Knees against one wall, back against the other, push upward. The movements came back to me, muscle memory that 40 years had not erased. I climbed. The narrow section came, and I wedged myself through it, feeling the brick scrape against my sides. The bend came, and I twisted around it. My lungs labored, not from soot now, but from age and the exertion of climbing. Finally, I reached the top and emerged into daylight, gasping and trembling. The crowd was silent. Then someone began to applaud, and others joined in. But I could see in their faces that the demonstration had worked. They understood now in a way they never could have from reading or hearing about it. They had watched a grown man struggle through that structure. Imagining a small child doing it day after day was almost unbearable. Several of the members of Parliament came to speak with me afterward. They asked questions about my experiences, about what could be done to ensure that such practices never returned. I answered as best I could, though I was exhausted and shaken from the climb. That night I had the old nightmare again, trapped in darkness, unable to move, unable to breathe, dying by inches. But the demonstration had its effect. New legislation was proposed, strengthening enforcement and closing remaining loopholes. It passed with large majorities in both houses of Parliament. The few master sweeps who had continued to use boys in violation of the existing law were prosecuted. The practice of using climbing boys, which had seemed so permanent and inevitable when I was a child, was finally, truly ended. I was 60 years old when I gave my last public speech. It was at a gathering of the Reform Society that had first published my book all those years ago. I was an old man by then, my body worn out by hard labor in childhood and decades of advocacy in adulthood. My lungs were bad and I coughed frequently. My hands shook. My back was bent, but my mind was still clear. And I had things I wanted to say. When I was a child, I began, my voice stronger than I had expected. I believed that the world was divided into two kinds of people, those who suffered and those who caused suffering. I believed that I would always be in the first category, that nothing I did could ever change my circumstances or the circumstances of boys like me. I was wrong. The world is more complicated than that. Yes, there are those who exploit and those who are exploited, but there are also those who fight exploitation, who work to build a better world. I was fortunate enough to become one of those people and to see real change happen in my lifetime. The practice that nearly killed me, that did kill so many of my friends, is now illegal and largely extinct. That is an achievement worth celebrating. But it is not enough. Children are still exploited in other ways, still used as cheap labor in dangerous conditions. Our work is not done. I'm an old man now and I will not live to see the end of child labor. But some of you will. Some of you will live to see a world where children are valued for who they are, not what they can produce, where they are educated instead of exploited, where they are protected instead of used. That world is possible. I know it is because I have seen impossible things become real in my own lifetime. I have seen a practice that was considered necessary and inevitable end because people decided it must end. I have seen laws change, attitudes shift, justice prevail. So I ask you to continue the fight. Do it for George, who died stuck in a chimney at age 6. Do it for Harry, who died sick in a cellar. Do it for Jack, who fell and broke his back. Do it for Tom, who chose death over continued suffering. Do it for all the nameless boys who climbed and died and were forgotten. But most of all, do it for the children who are alive now, who are suffering now, who need someone to fight for them. They cannot fight for themselves. They need us. They need you. I sat down to thunderous applause, though I barely heard it. I was thinking of those boys, my friends from so long ago. I was thinking of the cellar where we had slept, of the darkness of the chimneys, of the terrible waste of young lives. I was thinking of how much had changed, and how much still needed to change. After the speech, many people came to shake my hand, to thank me for my work. Among them was a young man, perhaps 25 years old, with the bearing of someone educated and prosperous. He waited until the others had left, then approached me nervously. "Sir," he said, "I wanted to thank you. Your book, it changed my life. How so?" I asked. "My father was a master sweep," he said. "He employed climbing boys. When I was a child, I thought nothing of it. It was just what was done. But then I read your book, and I understood what those boys were experiencing. I confronted my father. We had a terrible argument. Eventually, he agreed to stop using children and to use mechanical devices instead. But more than that, your book showed me that I could not be neutral. I could not simply accept the world as it was. I had to work to change it. I became a teacher because of you. I work in a school for poor children, teaching them to read and write and calculate. It is my way of atoning for my father's sins and my own blindness." I gripped his hand. "You have nothing to atone for. You were a child yourself. What matters is what you do now, and you are doing good work. Those children you teach, you are giving them tools to change their own lives. That is the greatest gift anyone can give." After he left, I sat alone for a long time thinking about what he had said. My book had changed his life. How many others had it affected? How many people had read those words I had written in the evenings after work at the printer's shop and decided to do something, to change something? I would never know the full extent of the impact, but I knew it was real. I knew that those boys had not died for nothing, that their story had mattered. That was enough. Say it had to be enough. I lived for 5 more years after that speech. They were quiet years, mostly spent in my small apartment, reading and writing letters and receiving occasional visitors. My body continued to fail. The cough got worse. I had difficulty walking. But my mind remained clear until nearly the end. On my last morning, I woke to see sunlight streaming through my window. It was a beautiful spring day, the kind of day that makes you glad to be alive. I lay in my bed too weak to rise, and I thought about my life. I thought about the small boy I had been, sold for 3 shillings and a loaf of bread. I thought about the chimneys I had climbed, the darkness and terror and pain. I thought about my friends who had died one by one, used up and discarded. I thought about Master Grimshaw and the system that had made his cruelty possible. But I also thought about what had come after. The book I had written, the laws that had changed, the children who had been saved from the fate I had suffered, the young man whose father had stopped employing climbing boys, the teacher who was giving poor children an education. All the small victories that had accumulated over the years into something significant. I thought about that morning in Whitechapel when I had seen the boy laughing with his mother, and I had known he would not be sold to a sweepmaster. That knowledge, that certainty, was worth everything I had endured. As the sunlight moved across my floor, I felt a great weariness settle over me. I was so tired. I had been tired for 65 years, tired in my bones and blood and soul. I was ready to rest. I closed my eyes and thought of Tom waiting for me in that narrow chimney in Belgravia. I thought of George and Harry and Jack, all the boys who had gone before me into the darkness. I thought of them not as they had been in life, frightened, hurt, desperate, but as they might have been if they had lived in a better world. I imagined them playing, laughing, growing up to have lives of their own, and then finally I let go. The tiredness lifted. The pain faded. I felt myself rising, as I had risen so many times through those narrow flues, but this time there was no darkness, no choking soot, no scraping walls. There was only light and warmth and the sense of climbing towards something better. I had survived. I had told the story. I had helped change the world, even if only a little. That was enough. That would always be enough. The old woman who looked after me found me later that morning peaceful in my bed. She said my face was calm, almost smiling, as though I had finally found the rest I had been seeking all my life. They buried me in a proper cemetery, not a pauper's field. My tombstone bore my name and the dates of my life, along with a simple inscription chosen by the Reform Society. He gave voice to the voiceless. But I like to think that my real memorial was not a stone marker, but something more enduring. A world where children no longer had to climb through darkness, where laws protected the vulnerable, where the story of suffering had been heard and had changed hearts and minds. That was the monument built by my life, and the lives of all those boys who had climbed before me and beside me. We had been small and powerless, used and discarded, but our story had proved stronger than the system that had tried to destroy us. We had mattered. We had made a difference, and in the end, perhaps that is all any of us can hope for. To survive, to tell the truth, to leave the world a little better than we found it, to transform suffering into meaning, loss into memory, darkness into light. The chimneys still stand, of course. They are part of London's architecture, part of its history, but now they are cleaned by men with brushes and machines, not by small boys risking their lives. Now they are a reminder, not of ongoing horror, but of horror that was ended, of a practice that was abolished, because people decided it must be abolished sometimes. I imagine people look at those chimneys and wonder what it was like, what those climbing boys experienced. If they want to know, they can read my book. They can read about George and Tom and Harry and Jack. They can read about the darkness and the fear and the pain. But more importantly, they can read about what happened after, the change, the reform, the victory of compassion over cruelty. They can read about how small voices, raised together, can become loud enough to change the world. That is the story I set out to tell all those years ago in Mr. Hartley's printing shop. That is the story I lived. And now at last the story is complete. The chimney boy's lament has ended. The chimney boy can rest.